distressed for the young man and his family, but I think the outpouring in the United Kingdom has demonstrated that we won't be unsettled by this. We will look for causes. We continue to work with every part of the population in the United Kingdom to take away those elements that would seek to divide and to radicalise. And we all hope that such an incident like this will be the last of its kind.
Not so sure about that. That was UK Conservative MP Alistair Burt, and Mr. Burt was commenting on the horrific terror attack that has left the people of London shocked. On Wednesday, two men with knives and a cleaver hacked a British soldier to death. It happened in broad daylight in the suburb of Woolwich, near London's military barracks. Two people have been arrested in connection with the murder. Security expert David Harris joins us with more from Ottawa. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Brian.
You know, when people think of terror, the war on terror, they think of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, buildings blowing up, bombs going off in the streets. They very rarely think of one man or two men attacking another man in the street.
That's right. And, of course, it's all the more shocking for that. But it is, as Daniel Pipes once described this kind of thing in the face of Western innocence and naivety, a process of education by murder. We are only now, through this kind of violence, I think, beginning to get a hint of the extent to which the enemy, and we have to use our language advisedly, is well and truly among us in a number of our Western societies. We've seen major shifts through demographic change wrought by immigration. We've seen so-called domestic radicalization, whether it be thanks to the Internet, by radical imams, or through friends and relatives or other means. And there's been no shortage, to be sure, of advice and information about this coming from intelligence services that have been studying these trends. And the trends are not good. What we're seeing here is a reminder of that simple fact.
Domestic radicalization, homegrown terrorism, David. How do you combat this? I mean, a man walks up to another man and starts hacking away on the streets of a major metropolitan center. How can you protect against that?
Well, of course, it's extremely difficult, and that's why some of the so-called al-Qaeda thinkers like al-Susri have been commending precisely this kind of stratagem to their own forces for some years. We've seen that a fellow by the name of Naji has been pressing for the infiltration of our societies, again, through immigration or otherwise, in ways that would get people who are, to put it mildly, not our friends, into our government, into police forces and intelligence forces, if it comes to that, as well as the public sector, and that including some of our most sensitive of infrastructure. So we are supremely vulnerable as a society that's not simply open, but a society that has prided itself on its openness. How do we deal with that? Well, we have to begin by looking at some of the policy issues we're facing. We must try to limit our immigration, at least from those dangerous countries, in line with what some of the moderate Muslims like Tariq Fatah and Rahil Raza have called upon the government to do. Where there are terrorism and radical producing countries, Pakistan is often cited as an example, Somalia and so on, we've got to limit the intake. And that's no condemnation of the bulk of people in such countries and communities. It just recognizes a simple fact that we, at a minimum, have to protect our social cohesion so that we don't see a kind of reactive tribalizing where various groups then, scared to death of one another on the streets, for reasons we've seen in recent videos, begin to act out against one another. And at that point, you have lost not merely community, but society as it would be recognized and any capacity to protect and preserve itself. We've got to ensure that police forces are watched very carefully in the course of some of their outreach. They have been engaging with, as the term has it, any number of communities, and unfortunately the record is spotty to say the least. We've seen radicals and radical organizations here in Canada, in London, Ontario is a very good recent example, but not simply there, Toronto, Ottawa, and elsewhere, having legitimacy conferred upon them by police force efforts to include some questionable groups and individuals in outreach. Those forms of legitimacy are taken to the bank forever by radical individuals who are then able to translate that into further exposure and credibility through media, through government involvement, and so on. So we have really got to be strict and apply the universal standards and values that we've long embraced to all groups and individuals, and not make too many allowances on the grounds of and in the name of outreach.
But David, in this society, in the West, let's call it what it is, we are an inclusive society. How do you get to the point where you become exclusive, where you're excising the people that could potentially become the perpetrators of domestic terrorism, radicals, and all such other things? How do you do that?
Well, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is, as you well know, violence, of course, is the supremely obvious end game of any number of groups involved in this, but not by a very long shot of all groups that we should be considering troubling. There is this concept of the transmission belt from radicalism, nonviolent radicalism, even nonviolent extremism, on to outright violence. And we have to, by doing our simple homework, and sometimes, frankly, this involves nothing more than a Google search, nothing more than that, we can identify those groups that have had inappropriate affiliations, that have had significant players indulging themselves in radical ideological talk, and simply say to police, to government and others, you have no business having anything to do with those kinds of groups, because they are only making more credible the very ideologies that we saw acted out on the streets of London so recently.
David, it is troublesome that we have to have a conversation of this nature, but troublesome though it may be, it is absolutely vital and necessary. I thank you for this.
Thank you so much, Brian.
You bet. That's David Harris. He's a security expert joining us from Ottawa.